there is now a definite pattern of escalation. Now, if I can just discuss the Solomon Islands. Now, there's a lot of people who talk about the Solomon Islands as being in Australia's backyard. I actually read a piece, this is where maps are so misleading because the Indo-Pacific region is enormous. I mean, it's far and away the largest area, unified area of the world. So actually the Solomon Islands are up over 3,000 kilometers from Australia. So you're not actually quite as close to Australia as people say. But the Solomon Islands are important. They are in some way a kind of gateway to Australia. They're also, and this is something which I think has a lot of traction with some people in Australia and some people in the United States, they're also the place where a lot of those big World War II battles that we remember, Guadalcanal, for example, took place. The Japanese sent troops to the Solomon Islands, invaded the Solomon Islands. This was seen as a threat to Australia. The United States and Australia responded. There were all these very difficult battles in the Solomon Islands chain. And I believe the Battle of the Coral Sea, one of the big naval battles, also happened around there. So this is an area which has history as part of the major battlegrounds between Japan and the Western Allies, the United States, Australia primarily, during the Second World War. So you can see why it is sensitive. But why has this security pact arisen? Now, we don't know the full details. A draft of this security pact appeared in March, but it seems the history of this is that the Solomon Islands has been very close politically to Australia, basically since the Second World War. But a lot of the businesses in the Solomon Islands are owned by the Chinese, and the Chinese have a very substantial business community there. In last year, there were big protests in the Solomon Islands. Those protests, unfortunately, escalated into riots. The Australian government sent troops to control those riots. Those troops were concentrated in protecting key infrastructure. The result is that a lot of the riots then started to target Chinese businesses, and the Chinese were very angry that Chinese businesses and Chinese people got attacked and weren't protected, and that led to negotiations between the Solomon Islands government and China, and the Chinese either brought up these riots and the fact that there'd been these attacks on Chinese businesses either as a pretext or as a point of pressure, or because they were really concerned about it. It doesn't even really matter what the truth is. But the fact is they were able to use these protests and these riots and the fact that the Solomon Islands depends economically so much on Chinese business now to persuade the Solomon Islands government to enter into this security agreement with China. Now, the text of this security agreement with China doesn't talk about a base, but it does clearly envisage China having some kind of security role in the Solomon Islands. And overtly, it is to prevent things like those protests and those riots and those attacks on Chinese businesses happening again. But it's easy to see from the draft of the agreement that's been published, the actual document, the actual agreement is being kept private, that it could eventually expand to include things like naval bases and air bases and those sort of things. That's not apparently the plan at the moment, but it could turn out that way. So if you start getting Chinese naval bases and air bases in the Solomon Islands, then of course the geopolitical landscape in the Pacific changes. Australia is on the back foot. The military picture becomes immensely more complicated, and we can start to see a whole area of conflict reopening in many of the same places which we had conflict in during the Second World War. So it's not completely surprising that the Americans and the Australians are reacting in a very, very fierce way to this thing. even if the actual proposals, the actual agreements at the moment are actually, they don't really approach any of the concerns that people in Australia and the US are expressing. And what they do show is how the Chinese footprint over the Pacific is steadily expanding. And now, of course, we've had all those comments from Yellen and from Wendy Sherman about Taiwan, about Russia, about Ukraine. We've had other things from the European Union as well. And it's difficult to avoid seeing the reaction to this as anything other than a further sign that we are now in a period of global conflict between the two great power blocs, and even a security agreement like this, which I suspect, if it had been made 15 years ago, would have gone by largely unnoticed and would not have been seen as having any particular larger strategic consequences. It is now seen as having those larger strategic consequences, not, I suspect, just by the Western powers, but ultimately by the Chinese as well.
Yeah, this explains all the statements coming out of DC vis-a-vis China and the threat of sanctions. I think it also explains NATO and how NATO now is starting to create this alliance of partners in the Pacific and in this region as well, and they're starting to engage a lot more with countries that are sympathetic to NATO in that region. It seems like NATO is also preparing for an eventual smash with China. It seems like this is
Yes.
also kind of gaining its own inertia, its own momentum, slowly. While we're all
I don't think
fixated
it's
on Ukraine and Russia, we've got this brewing up now.
I don't think it's slow at all. That's the only part of your statement I don't agree with. I think it's actually extremely fast. I think we're moving very, very fast to a smash in the Pacific, just as, of course, we've now moved to a smash in Ukraine. And I think this is inevitable. I think this is what's coming. I think the real big question is, do we manage to get through this without, having, ending up in any kind of hot war? Not between China and Taiwan. I personally think that's now baked in the cake. I think that's coming. A hot war between China and the United States, which would have absolutely awesome consequences for the world. That would be a far bigger event than the clash over, the clash we're seeing in Ukraine. And of course, the sanctions, I think we did a program about this about 2 weeks ago when the US imposed visa restrictions on Chinese officials for no real good reason that I could see. Well, it seems to me we discussed this during that program. We said that we're on the first step of the sanctions escalator. We're now seeing Yellen and Sherman talking about sanctions, which are going to take us a whole way up, further way up the sanctions escalator. It seems that seems to me clear that that's where we're going as well.
Yeah, and I think China has been watching on with great interest as to what sanctions they've put on Russia, and I'm sure they're preparing on their side as well for the eventual sanctions to come. I mean, there's no doubt about it that they're going to start preparing as well.
Absolutely,
And
absolutely.
I think the Chinese are going to retaliate in a much different way if we get to that point. When we get to that point, they're going to retaliate in a much different way than how Russia plays it.
I entirely agree. I mean, I think it was very interesting to learn from the Russians, from Putin's spokesman, Peskov, that the Russians have been aware of the fact that sanctions, big sanctions against them were coming for at least a year and were working out what they would do to protect and insulate their own economy. But what the Russians haven't been able to do, because of course they don't have the economic weight to do it, they haven't retaliated in the kind of way that China will retaliate. Now, bear in mind, for the Chinese, their major point of vulnerability in a sanctions war, in an economic war of attrition, is China's problems with essential materials, with oil, gas, coal. China's a big consumer of coal, food, some rare metals, even some rare earths. Now, this reconfiguration of Russian economic policy towards China is, of course, exactly the solution they need to be able to counter all of that. So that's probably what's happening. The question is, I assume people in the United States realize that. Do they wait until the Chinese have all that sorted out? With the the new Power of Siberia pipelines, with the coal and the oil pipeline, the coal shipments and the oil pipelines and all that. Do they wait, or do they escalate now, whilst China still looks vulnerable? And of course, if there is an escalation from the Western side, be absolutely sure there'll be an escalation, an analogous escalation from the Chinese side. The Chinese are there in all the supply chains. The US is a major debtor to China. I mean, the economic disruptions we're experiencing now over the Ukraine crisis will pale into insignificance compared to what we will see if we end up in a kind of economic war of attrition against the Chinese.
Yeah, and I imagine the announcement that the U.S. along with Australia are going to be developing the hypersonic weapons. That's geared towards China as well. A lot of people are kind of hint to the fact, well, that's kind of meant to deal with Russia. I see it as more of a way to deal with what's going to be coming in China, the hypersonic
Well, of
development
course it
between
is.
those two
I
those
mean,
two
what,
countries.
of course it is. I mean, Australia is not threatened by Russia in any way. Russia's far away. I mean, its focus is on Europe. It's not a threat to Australia. But of course, the Australians have got themselves into a situation where they perceive a threat from China. So, of course, the only reason why Australia would want to be involved in this kind of program is precisely because it perceives a threat from China. So that's why it's involving itself in this kind of program. And how will the Chinese respond to that? Well, they've already made that big hypersonic glide vehicle test a few months ago. And of course, they will turn to the country that's already mastered hypersonic technology and use it in action in Ukraine with those missile strikes by the Kinjal missiles that took place there, which is, of course, Russia. So we're going to see hypersonic missiles on both sides. We're going to see nuclear submarines. We're going to see all sorts of things happening in the Pacific. We're going to see Chinese aircraft carriers. And of course, the other two great powers in the region, well, India already, in my opinion, a great power in all but name. Indonesia perhaps gradually working its way towards becoming one too. They're looking at all of this. The Indians, as it turned out, were extremely unhappy about the AUKUS deal, the nuclear submarine deal between the United States and Australia, about which they were not informed, it seems, in advance, and they were very angered by that. I think they're having doubts about whether they should really become part of this American alliance system. If they decide that they won't, they will turn to their major arms supplier, the country that can provide them with all that kind of technology, which is, of course, Russia. And you start to see Indian hypersonic missiles developed as well. And we're going to have an arms race in the Pacific. And I'm afraid this is now baked in the cake. I'm sure this is where we're going to go. I'm sure we're going to see a sanctions war. We're heading now towards a Cold War with a fundamental difference to the Cold War One. Cold War One was about an ideological conflict, ultimately an ideological conflict in Europe, in the northwestern Europe Atlantic region. This Cold War is going to be global. It's going to touch directly every part of the world. The Pacific will be a front, Europe will be a front, the Arctic will also be a front, and of course we'll have conflicts and struggles in the global south, in Africa, in all sorts of places like that, as these two great blocs maneuver for advantage against each other. The Solomon Islands Agreement is another indicator that that's where we're going.
Yeah, it's another step towards that direction. And this Cold War is also going to weigh heavily on the economic side of things as well.
Oh, absolutely.
For everybody
It's going to be in a
involved,
completely
every
different
country.
economic
Yeah.
Every country will be. I mean, Olaf Scholz talked about the end of low prices. That's the least of it. We're going to see lots of things that we've got used to. I mean, it's going to be the end of the kind of globalization that some people imagined. The days, where we could easily get, fruit from, Africa and all those things in Europe. Of course, globalization has not been without its costs, as we've discussed so often in so many programs. But that kind of system is ending. And it's ending forever. I mean, I don't ever see it coming back, at least not in our lifetimes. There have been two periods of globalization.